At first glance, Hailey Bieber looks like the kind of woman modern fame was designed to worship. Clean skin, controlled beauty, quiet luxury, a face so polished it almost feels artificial in its calm. And in the present day, that image has only become more powerful. Rhode, the beauty brand she founded in 2022, became so successful that ELF Beauty announced a $1 billion deal to acquire it in May 2025, with Hailey staying on in a leadership role. That is not the story of a girl surviving on borrowed attention. That is the story of a woman building an empire out of surface, discipline, and immaculate control. But that is exactly where the darker part begins. Because the more perfect Hailey looked, the less the public wanted to believe in her perfection as something real. They wanted to cut it open, to test it, to ask what was hiding underneath the skin, the marriage, the stillness. She was never just beautiful in the eyes of the audience. She was suspiciously beautiful, suspiciously composed, suspiciously calm. And when a woman looks that effortless for too long, people stop admiring the image and start accusing it of being fake. That is the first wound in Hailey Bieber's story. Perfection did not protect her. It made her easier to pick apart. But the public did not only pick apart the beauty, they picked apart the love story behind it. No matter how sleek the image became, Hailey was never allowed to enter marriage as if she were the beginning of anything. In the public imagination, she arrived as the woman who came after a romance people still refused to bury. Justin and Hailey's reconnection in 2018 moved fast, a July engagement, then a September courthouse marriage. And that speed became part of the problem. It made the relationship feel, to many people, less like a new beginning and more like an abrupt rewrite of a story they were not emotionally ready to let go of. So Hailey was not just watched as a wife. She was watched as the woman people believed had to keep proving she belonged there. That is the hook at the center of her story. Not simply that she married Justin Bieber, but that the public kept casting her as the one chasing a love they still believed emotionally belonged to someone else. Even motherhood did not fully soften that gaze. When she and Justin welcomed their son, Jack Blues Bieber, in August 2024, the public still did not look at Hailey with the clean simplicity usually granted to a new chapter. They looked at her through the old one, and that is what makes this story darker than romance. Hailey Bieber did not step into love as a woman the public wanted to celebrate. She stepped into it as a woman the public had already decided to compare. Long before Hailey Bieber became the woman people argued over online, she was already growing up inside a world where being seen came earlier than being understood. She was born into the Baldwin family, with the strange advantage and burden of public familiarity already built into her name. That matters because Hailey did not enter fame as a blank page. She entered it as someone the public thought they already knew something about, even before she had built anything of her own. And that kind of beginning changes a person's image before it even becomes a career. She was not first introduced to the world as a founder, a wife, or even a fully formed star. She was introduced as a girl orbiting fame, close enough to celebrity to be watched, but not yet powerful enough to control how she was being watched. That is where the emotional seed of her story begins. Because when a woman grows up publicly adjacent to power, people rarely let her arrive later as her own person. They keep reading her through old names, old families, old associations. In Hailey's case, the public learned to see her before it learned to listen to her. And once that happens, image hardens very quickly. A face becomes a surface. A last name becomes a shortcut. A young woman becomes something people think they can summarize without ever really meeting. Her entry into fashion only sharpened that problem. Hailey moved into modeling in her teens, and that matters not because model is the main story, but because modeling trained the public to consume her visually before it ever asked who she was. Vogue's 2025 profile notes that she entered the fashion world as a model in her teens, while career summaries list early campaigns and runway work in the mid-2010s as the period when her public image first took shape. What formed around her in that phase was not a dramatic personality, but a look. Polished, leggy, modern, blonde, controlled, a girl who fit perfectly into the grammar of fashion and celebrity culture. And that is where the deeper setup for the whole arc appears. Because once a woman becomes legible first through image, people start treating her identity like styling. They think they can read motive from aesthetics, character from beauty, and truth from surface. Hailey's early career did not yet make her powerful, but it did make her visible in a very specific way, as someone sleek enough to project onto. Before Rhode, before marriage, before the public wars over Justin, she was already being framed as a beautiful surface moving through famous circles. That is why her later burden hit so hard. The woman people would eventually accuse of being fake, strategic, too polished, too perfect, was shaped in an environment that rewarded exactly those surfaces long before she had the authority to define them for herself. The real rise of Hailey Bieber did not happen because she suddenly became the most talented model in the room or the loudest celebrity in the frame. It happened when the public finally found a version of her they could instantly recognize and endlessly consume. She moved from being a Baldwin-adjacent young model into something far more specific. An IT girl image built out of clean lines, glossy skin, expensive restraint, and the illusion of effortless control. Vogue's 2025 profile looks back on how she entered fashion in her teens, while career timelines place her runway and campaign visibility across the mid-2010s as the period when her face became familiar in a much bigger way. But the important shift was not simply professional. It was emotional. Hailey stopped being a girl from a famous family who models and became a surface people could instantly read. Blonde, polished, modern, enviably calm. This is where her image began to harden into something the public would later treat as both aspiration and provocation. She looked like the kind of woman who should make people want to copy her. Instead, she also made them want to test whether she was real. That is what makes this stage so important. Her rise was not only upward, it was inward. The image became tighter, cleaner, more controlled, and therefore easier for people to accuse of being too controlled to be natural. That breakthrough became much more dangerous once love and branding fused into the same public face. Justin and Hailey reconnected in 2018, got engaged in July, and married in a New York courthouse in September, a speed that made the relationship feel abrupt and emotionally controversial to a public still attached to the older Justin-Selena narrative. This is the point where Hailey stops being merely an it girl and becomes a public symbol people cannot look at neutrally. She is no longer just beautiful. She is the wife. She is no longer just stylish. She is the girl who got him. And once that happens, every outfit, every expression, every interview, every stillness of her face gets pulled into a bigger story she did not fully author. What makes this part even more important is that Hailey eventually turned image into power through Rhode, launched in 2022 as a deliberately stripped-back skincare label built on the exact visual logic the public already associated with her. Edited, minimal, polished, glowing. Rhode's own site frames the brand around simplicity, quality, and an effortless glow, while by 2025, the company had become valuable enough for ELF Beauty to strike its billion-dollar acquisition deal. So Part 3 should not end like a fairy tale. It should end like a trap closing beautifully. Hailey Bieber had finally built an image powerful enough to stand on its own, but it was the same image the public would spend years trying to tear open. This is where Hailey Bieber's story stops looking like glossy celebrity culture and starts feeling like emotional entrapment. Because the hardest thing she had to carry was not just public scrutiny in the abstract. It was a very specific role the public kept forcing onto her. The girl who chased a love story they still believed belonged to someone else. That is what made her image so fragile in a way people rarely admit. She was not only being judged as a wife, a model, or a beauty founder. She was being judged against a ghost romance that millions of people had already turned into mythology. Justin and Hailey's reconnection in 2018 moved with a speed that made the public narrative even harsher. An engagement in July, then a courthouse marriage in September. And once that happened, many people did not look at Hailey as the woman he chose in the present. They looked at her as the woman who arrived before they had emotionally buried the past. That is the wound at the center of this story. Not just that Hailey married Justin Bieber, but that she married him under the weight of a romance the public still treated as unfinished. People's timeline of Justin and Hailey openly notes how quickly the engagement and civil marriage happened in 2018, while People's own Selena Hailey timeline makes clear how long the public kept pitting the two women against each other and treating Hailey as if she had entered an already sacred narrative. And once a woman is cast in that role, everything she does starts looking incriminating. Her calm becomes calculation. Her patience becomes strategy. Her beauty becomes manipulation. The public no longer sees her as someone living inside a marriage. It sees her as someone who must constantly prove she deserves the marriage at all. That is why Hailey's burden cuts deeper than ordinary fandom hostility. She was not simply criticized, she was narratively trapped. The internet did not need evidence that she was chasing anything. It only needed the emotional convenience of deciding she must have been. Because if Hailey was the girl who chased, then the old love story could remain pure in people's minds. It could stay tragic, unfinished, and emotionally protected. She became useful as the woman who made the fantasy feel interrupted rather than ended. And that is a brutal place to live inside publicly, because it means your actual relationship will never be judged on its own terms. It will always be measured against something the audience already decided was more romantic, more authentic, more deserving. That is not just scrutiny. That is exile inside somebody else's nostalgia. What makes the story even darker is that public hostility did not really end when life moved forward. It only changed shape. In 2022, Hailey publicly tried to shut down the narrative that she had stolen Justin, saying there was all love between her and Selena, and later that year the two women even posed together publicly in a widely discussed photo that was supposed to put feud rumors to rest. But the fact that such a moment was needed at all shows how overwhelming the public script had become. Even motherhood did not fully free her from it. When Hailey and Justin welcomed their son, Jack Blues Bieber, in August 2024, the life event was intimate, concrete, and irreversible, the kind of thing that should have forced the audience to stop treating her like a placeholder and start seeing her as a woman in her own actual life. But public narratives built on romantic nostalgia do not die easily. They survive facts. They survive time. Sometimes they even survive a child. And that is the tragedy of Hailey Bieber's Part 4. The burden was never just loving Justin. It was loving him, while the audience kept looking over her shoulder, still staring at a previous chapter. At the exact same time, she was building Rhode into a real business empire, one that would later sell to ELF Beauty in a billion-dollar deal. That contrast is what makes the fracture so sharp. In private and in business, Hailey was clearly building a life, a marriage, a brand, and eventually a family. In public, she was still being reduced to a role in somebody else's unresolved emotional mythology. That is why this section should not be written like gossip. It should be written like image damage by repetition. Hailey Bieber was not destroyed by one event. She was worn down by a story that kept insisting she was the wrong woman in the right place. And once a woman is trapped inside that kind of narrative, even her happiness starts looking suspicious to people who were never ready to forgive her for arriving after the love story they preferred. In the present day, Hailey Bieber no longer looks like someone surviving inside another person's fame. She looks like someone who turned image into power. Rhode, the brand she launched in 2022, became large enough for ELF Beauty to announce a $1 billion deal in 2025, while Hailey stayed on in a leadership role. At the same time, her life with Justin moved further into reality with the birth of their son, Jack Blues Bieber, in August 2024. That matters because the old public narrative kept framing her as the girl chasing a love story that belonged to someone else. But the woman standing here now does not look like a placeholder. She looks like someone who built a business, a family, and a public identity strong enough to stop depending on that old script. But the ending should not feel too clean. Hailey's legacy is not just that she won or that she proved the public wrong. It is darker than that. She became one of the clearest examples of how a woman can be reduced to a role in someone else's romance, then spend years being judged through that role no matter how much real life she builds outside it. The public once looked at her as the girl who arrived after the story they preferred. In the end, she built something too real to fit inside that old fantasy. And maybe that is the final aftertaste of Hailey Bieber's arc. She was never destroyed by the narrative, but she was forced to outgrow it while the public was still trying to keep her trapped inside it.